In the last section of the course, we looked at the problems that students might have when they're reading. And what I want to look at now is the type of text that we might want to use in our reading lessons. And I'm going to be discussing two main types of texts: authentic texts and specially written or simplified texts. In the audiolingual period, one of the tenets of the audiolingual method was the idea that students shouldn't be exposed to language which they couldn't understand or use productively. So the idea was that first they should hear the language, then they should say it, and only afterwards should they see the written form. Well, obviously, taken to its extreme, this means that only language which has been previously taught for productive use can actually be used for reading. And the type of reading text that were very often used with learners were simplified texts. So what do we mean by simplified text? Well, first of all, there are different types of simplified text. What probably springs to mind is the type of simplified text that you get in graded readers sometimes, where a work of literature has been rewritten in simpler language. However, there are other types. There are simple accounts. For example, if you take a scientific textbook that's been written for 10-year-olds, that's not going to be written in the same sort of language as it would be if it was written for postgraduate scientists. So that's a simple account. On the other hand, there are also texts which have been specifically written for non-native speakers, for language learners. So how might a text be simplified for language learners? There are three main areas of simplification, and those are lexical control, structural control, and thirdly, information control. Let's look at those in turn. First of all, lexical control. We've seen already on the course that in the 1940s, in the 1950s, a lot of people worked on the idea of word counts, the 100 most frequent words in the language, the 300 most frequent words, the 1,000 most frequent words, and so on. So that's one way that you can control the simplicity or complexity of the text, by only using vocabulary which is extremely frequent and which the learners at their stage of learning are liable to know. The same thing with structural control. You can actually limit the text to certain structures. So, for example, here I've got the catalogue from one set of published graded readers, and that tells me that at stage 1, which is the first stage, the readers will only use the simple present, the present progressive, the imperative, and the simple past of regular and some irregular verbs. At stage 2, we go on to the simple past of all listed verbs. We have the present perfect, future with will, and the past progressive. At stage 3, the present perfect progressive is brought in, and the past perfect, and so on. So we're actually writing within certain structures and not using others. Structural complexity can also be controlled by determining things like sentence length and complexity, how many clauses there are in the sentences, and so on. That leaves us with information control. What do we mean by information control? Well, for example, how many characters are included in the story or in each chapter of the story. That makes a difference in the complexity, because think of the cohesion. If you've got 2 male characters and you're using he, then it's much more difficult to understand than if you've got 1 male and 1 female character, so that you're using he and she. Other elements of information control: the cultural background, the references to specifically culture-specific details, or also in a story, is it narrated chronologically or are there flashbacks? So this type of control can also make a text more or less complex. With the advent of the communicative approach in the 70s, the idea of writing texts in simple language within the language competence of the learners went out of vogue. The idea was that students needed to be exposed to the language that they were going to meet outside the classroom. That if they were going to be dealing with text written for native speakers outside the classroom, then the classroom had to prepare them for that. And that they needed to be taught coping strategies for things that they didn't understand, but also that we needed to take into account that receptive competence could be far, far higher than productive competence. So this was a very definite break with the audiolingual tradition. So this led to what Day and Bamford have called the cult of authentic materials. The idea that authentic materials were far superior to specifically written materials, and that it was those that should be used in the classroom. By authentic materials, remember, we're talking about materials originally written for native speakers. And the idea was, well, we come back to the phrase that I've talked about before, the dreaded phrase, you don't have to understand every word. The idea that even at low levels, students could extract certain details from text, and that we should be emphasising, concentrating on what they do understand and what they don't understand. And the other common saying that was, grade the task, not the text. In other words, give the students a task which they can do with and apply to the authentic materials, rather than trying to aim for total comprehension or whatever. So what were these tasks that we were using with students, which were graded rather than grading the material? Widdowson had pointed out that it's not actually enough to have an authentic text in the sense that it's a text written for native speakers. The task, the purpose for reading, also has to be authentic. And so a lot of emphasis in the classroom was placed on trying to develop authentic tasks for the students to carry out. So, for example, if they were reading a travel brochure, to plan a holiday or something like that. And as I said, the emphasis was very much on completing that task. Whether they actually understood all the words or whatever was irrelevant. So, between the audiolingual period and the early communicative period, we had a radical change in the approach to teaching reading, the principles on which teaching reading was based, and also the types of texts that we used and the types of tasks that we used with those texts. But where are we now? That's what I would like to look at in the second part of this video.